Hello friends, how are you? My name is Arithurier and today I'm going to talk about the Vikings, the History Channel TV series and some of the characters trying to perceive what is fiction and what is reality. I must admit that this series started in 2013, but I've only watched them in December of 2017 after my friends insisted that I should watch. And by friends I mean my cat. I probably come too late for this, but I thought it would be interesting to make a video about this TV series. The characters were based in sagas, folk tales, even myths and some historical facts. As a TV show, I would think the characters were completely made up. I mean, their relationship with each other and with the story itself, but surprisingly the show is closer to reality than to fantasy. This is a combination of Norse myths and some historical truths and obviously a good amount of fiction. The history of the Vikings has always been based on oral traditions, and those who wrote about them were their victims, portraying a very bleak setting about the Vikings as bloodthirsty hordes of godless hosts. And when the Scandinavians started to finally write about themselves, it was during the 13th century, and the Viking Age was over for already 200 years. So for centuries, society saw the Vikings as the mindless killers the Christians created. And you know how the History Channel is, lots of conspiracies and aliens, but this time the producers of the Vikings did their homework. And despite the historical gaps, this series gives us a good portrait of medieval Scandinavia. Alright, so let's take a look to what is reality and what is the historical truth and what inspired the creators of this TV series. Let's start with the main character Ragnar Lothbrok, played by Travis Fimmel, and his love story with Lagartha, played by Catherine Winnick. I'm a disgrace pronouncing real people's names. The couple was constructed by mythological figures of different medieval narratives. Ragnar Lothbrok is one of the most popular characters in Scandinavian mythology, a legendary hero linked to the clans or royal houses such as the Ynglinga and the Monson clans. In the series he is portrayed as a farmer, a landowner, and then after a series of conflicts he becomes a king. This king never existed in history. It's a character from mythological accounts and also from Old Norse poetry, but is a mixture of historical characters. Ragnar Lothbrok in the series might be the Ragnaros, a king of Denmark, which is mentioned in the 9th book of the Gesta Danorum, written by Saxo Grammaticus, a Danish historian between the 12th and the 13th centuries. This Ragnaros Lothbrok has amazing similarities with the 9th century Danish chieftain Rygineri. The names sound different, but it is the same name, only pronounced differently in Denmark, Germany and France. This chieftain Rygineri was the same man who invaded Paris during the 9th century, and we see that in the series. The Carolingian Empire suffered greatly at the hands of this Danish chieftain and the Vikings in general, but he had loads of fun pillaging France along the coast and was bold enough to attack Paris, and the Franks had to pay him great quantities of silver to get rid of him. In the series you also see that Ragnar Lothbrok has a lot of disputes with a King Horik, played by Donald Long. The chieftain Rygineri, after his attacks on Paris and around the French coast, returned to his superior, King Horik. Well, I could go on with loads of similarities, but this only to tell you that the Ragnar Lothbrok of the series is a mixture between the legendary hero and some historical characters. The Child Maiden Lagartha, Ragnar's first wife in the series, appears in the same chronicle about the legendary hero. According to the text, she was a prostitute that Ragnar frees, and then she begins to fight alongside him. Soon they marry, they separate, she marries again, she assassinates her second husband as in the series, and she also becomes a ruler of what is nowadays Norway. Lagartha from the series is based on the same Lagartha of the Chronicles, but she also seems to be a mixture of other legendary women from Norse mythology, and actually reminds me of Brunhild, a shield maiden and a Valkyrie of Norse mythology. Now let's speak about Rollo, played by Clive Standen. In the series he is the brother of Ragnar Lothbrok, and he turns his back on his people and becomes a French lord and general. He becomes a Frankish nobleman. In the fourth season, he is presented to us as a lord of Normandy. Alright, it's true, this Rollo really did change his allegiances. He became the first ruler of Normandy and Count of Rouen. But Ragnar Lothbrok is a 9th century character, and the entire series happens during the 9th century. Rollo only became the Duke of Normandy during the 10th century. These two people were never related, and if Ragnar Lothbrok had existed as a person, they would also never met each other. Or maybe they would, but Ragnar would be with an age to be Rollo's granddaddy or a very old father. The pillaging of Paris took place between the years 885 and 886. Rollo had invaded the Rouen region years before. We know that Rollo was one of the leaders of the looting and that the siege of Paris was solved with the delivery of treasures to the Vikings. If the negotiations itself happened and involved Rollo, it is impossible to know. As I have said before, Ragnar didn't exist, but the Danish chieftain Regineri existed and was on the siege of Paris. So after all, Rollo and Regineri did meet, possibly. Now let's take a look at historical events. What caught my attention in the very beginning of this series was the sunstone, the solarstone, that transparent rock Ragnar uses as a compass. This stone appears in Icelandic sources of the 13th century, an object used to find the sun, even in a completely overcast sky. Had I watched this series in 2013, I would have doubted this, but in 2015 or so, I actually wrote an article about this Viking compass. Navigation was a very complex and risky task during medieval times. I mean, by then a lot of people knew how to navigate, of course, but it was usually done around the coasts, never losing sight of land. To navigate far into the sea without any landmark for guidance, that was a job for madmen. So this object that appears at the beginning of the series was as important to both the character and the history of navigation. Used as a compass, the sunstone guided the first maritime adventures into open waters. The object became the main nautical orientation mechanism during the day. At night, it was the recognition of the polar star, so it was actually harder to navigate during the day than during the night. This object changed everything. Now let's talk about Viking weaponry. This is actually a subject for another video, but I'll take the opportunity to speak about it in here. Well, when it comes to describe the kind of weapons the Vikings used, people seem to have a fantastic idea about it. Not their fault though. For years, movies, books, comics, etc. portray the Vikings as having huge, impossible to handle double-bladed axes, monstrous hammers, and swinging such weapons with one hand and with the other, Steven Seagal style, slapping their enemies. And of course, every Viking had a sword. What I liked about this series was the detail they gave to the weapons the Vikings used. Not everyone had a sword, they were tremendously costly. The material to do weapons was scarce in Scandinavia. Iron, for instance, was taken from beneath the turfs, from swampy regions of the fjords, and from a handful of mud only a tiny portion of iron was actually used. So it was more common to use axes, spears and knives, mostly tools, and of course the classical round-shaped shields made of hard wood. This historical aspect is nicely portrayed in the TV series. About the invasions, even through historical records, it is complex to perceive the details of how everything happened. The chronology is difficult to trace, to make an historical line or sequence of events. There were no formulated plans to invade England and France. It was just a matter of successful raids, attacking fast, storming the places with small parties to go unnoticed, and turning back as fast as they came. The Vikings took advantage of the political fragility of the regions they attacked. For instance, historians don't speak much about this, but there were several Viking raids and great bloody battles in Portugal and Spain. The Vikings took advantage of the political and religious wars between Christians and Muslims. The Iberian Peninsula was so divided and fragile that most Vikings raided during spring and summer and passed the winter in their camps in the Iberian Peninsula. There was no need to return home. They stayed there, waiting for another spring and a long summer to raid again. England and France were concerned with the border conflicts of their kingdoms. No one expected lunatics coming from the far northern sea, but there they were, like monsters from the mist, came and went and left a trail of destruction and blood. People were unprepared, and that's why the Viking raids were so successful. In the Frankish kingdoms, the first known attack only occurred in 799, perpetuating sporadically until about 830, but the attack on Paris only occurred at 885 after the Great Invasion, which occurred between 856 and 862. The series make a cocktail mixing two historical moments into one. The sack of 845 led by Hygiene and the one of 885 to 886 where Rollo appears, 40 years apart. Another aspect I absolutely loved in this series were their hairs, wholesome hairstyles. We are mostly used to see Northmen with long wild hair, but in general most wore their hair short or shaved. It was more hygienic, and during medieval Europe the Vikings were indeed the most hygienic peoples of all Europe. They constantly combed their hairs and beards, and we find archaeological evidences of their hygiene. Women hairstyles, that's another aspect. We see beautifully elaborated braids, and it wasn't just to look beautiful, there was a purpose. Women of noble birth and with a high status braided their hair in a beautiful and elaborated fashion. Single women didn't braid their hairs and left them loose. Women also braided their hair and made a triple knot with the braids, which had a magical purpose. It was related to magic. On the other hand, in the show we see a wondrous variety of braids, including braids inspired in African culture for both men and women. They are beautiful, but those were not used by the Norse. And finally, in terms of the faith portrayed in this TV series, the show portrays the Norse faith as it is portrayed in the sources. They were more concerned with historical records rather than archaeological evidences. It's true that during the Viking Age, which was a particularly violent period in Scandinavian history, it was believed that those who died in battle would be permitted to enter in Valhalla, a great hall where half of the honorable warriors should go. So other aspects about the Norse faith aren't given much detail because during the Viking Age, war and dying in battle became much more important than other realities of the afterlife. During the Viking Age, Scandinavian people started to focus much more on deities related to war and battle. Sacrifices were voluntary in some cases, but in others the Vikings captured enemies and sacrificed those, especially in honor to Hygiene, the god of war. Of course, they still worshipped other deities such as Thor, the god of thunder and lightning, which also had been a god associated with agriculture, but during the Viking Age progressively became more associated with bravery in combat than anything else. The cult of Freyr was still very much alive, although I don't remember having seen that on the series. And in terms of goddesses, Freyja was the chief goddess to be worshipped among the Vikings, based on historical and archaeological accounts. And there is a debate that Freyja and the goddess Frigga were the exact same goddess, but that's something for another video. Alright friends, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have enjoyed this video. All the links to my social media are down below at the description. Thank you so much for watching, see you on the next video, and tack för idag!